welcome back, everybody, to the Social World podcast. I'm Dave Niven, and you can always just Google this as Thoughts on the Social World, and you'll get here as well. It's a real pleasure to have your company back again after the summer break, but I've got some really excellent podcasts coming up, excellent guests as usual, and I hope that it's going to sort of really stimulate your interest. Now, today, I'm really pleased to have Anne Longfield CBE, who has had at least 30 years now professionally of actually working with and being involved with professionally with children. And she was the Children's Commissioner for England from 2015 to 2021. But now she's the chair of the Commission on Young Lives, and she's not only very well networked, but she's also very carefully listened to, I believe. And
David, can I interrupt? I'm really,
yes.
really sorry. I'm the executive chair of the Centre for Young Lives.
Oh, I went, okay. Well, I'll tell you why I said that then, but that's fine to clear that up. Thank you.
Yeah.
Because you've now written a book. And the book, Young Lives, Big Ambitions, and on the back cover of it, it says you're the chair of the Commission on Young Lives.
Because when it was printed, I was.
Evolution,
Uh,
right? Okay, that's
Sensibly, I
lovely.
set the commission. I morphed into the Centre for Young Lives, which is an ongoing entity, and that launched at the beginning of February.
Excellent. Well, look, we're going to talk about that.
Yeah.
And thanks for coming on the program. Now, I think it's important that although I know of you, and obviously I've been kind of familiar with the work you did especially over the 6 years as Children's Commissioner, but not others might not know your history a little bit. If you could just sort of fill us in about the progress, your journey, if you like, and how you got to where you are.
Yeah, delighted to. And thanks so much for inviting me along for a chat. So all of my working life has been around children, young people and families. I first worked in the 80s with Save the Children Fund in the UK. In their research department, spent a lot of time in their projects, looking at what they did, spent some time working in parts of inner London during the GLC, Greater London Council days, that is, and then spent about 20 years at a charity which became For Children, which was very much about childcare, children's wider well-being, support for families, and Sure Start, a lot of campaigning and delivery around Sure Start. The Children's Commissioner for England's role is a huge privilege. It has fantastic powers around data collection. My focus there was very much about vulnerable children and young people, really trying to use that opportunity to shine a spotlight on quite where children fell through the gaps in our society, in our systems, in our support, and systematically looking at how services, support can lean into these children, can identify early on when they need help and what kind of help that might mean. From being Children's Commissioner, I've spent time, I set up the Commission on Young Lives, looking very much at vulnerable teenagers and putting forward recommendations to help protect those vulnerable teenagers, but also to give them a springboard to success. And the Centre for Young Lives was established as an ongoing entity at the beginning of this year. Much of this is continuing the work around vulnerable children and young people, because many have struggles in school as they're growing up, which has huge impacts on their life chances. And much of this can be prevented. So what we're seeking to do is to look at how we reset our services and support for children and young people, ensure that those who need it most get the help they need.
Okay. Thank you. Lovely. Excellently well put of what it seems like an incredibly packed career so far, but there we are. Listen, I want to pick up a couple of points, as it were, that you've been saying there, if that's all right, just to sort of check it from my point of view, but also let's take the 6 years you were commissioner for
Mm.
Children's Commissioner for England there. Just a couple of things I'm most interested in, because I was very well aware of you and your office during that time and the things that
Mm.
you were doing. But from your point of view, what stands out successfully first in your memory? You know, one or two things that you're really proud that you managed to sort of get through and achieve. And then I'll ask you one or two, any regrets that you've got after that.
I think the core of what I think we did well, and I'm really pleased we did, was really set up a framework for understanding vulnerability and focusing on it. And I was the third children's commissioner, and people don't tell you what to do when you're a children's, well, plenty of people do tell you what to do, but you don't get any formal instructions as such. You've got statutory responsibilities, but it's down to you to identify the areas which are most important to work upon. And the offices hadn't had evidence departments before. They hadn't had they hadn't had the range of powers until I came into post. I was
Mhm.
the first person that came into post with kind of strength and powers. So I set up an evidence team which would really bring clarity and data and evidence to what we all knew, that a lot of children were, for a whole range of reasons, at more risk of not being able to get on in life than others. So we established what we called a vulnerability framework, 140 different indicators of vulnerability, constantly updating. And that was, for me, something I was very, very proud of. And that then also, drew you to the areas of policy that you really needed to focus on. One of those was around children's mental health. Now, we all know now and accept that there's a big problem with children's mental health in this country. There's an epidemic, many would say, and I'd agree with them. But for the first few years I was children's commissioner, it was making the case for that actually children's mental health was a problem. There was quite a firm pushback to say, oh no, we've turned the curve, it's all in hand. And we stuck our necks out quite a lot to analyze the data to clearly show that what that meant, to talk to young people about their fears about not getting the help they need,
Mm.
and to make that part of mainstream dialogue, which I'm really proud
Well, I was
that
going
we
to ask
did.
you if I could just interrupt a sec, just sticking on that point for a moment. It
Yeah,
sounds to me like you managed to create, which is fantastic, an identification system, a kind of a more of a how to more clarity of the data involved, more evidence and so
yeah.
forth. That was terrific. But were you pleased with or disappointed with the policy implementers that could, doing things with what you had just actually given them?
Well, I mean, I wanted an awful lot more. No, I
Mm.
wasn't particularly pleased, is the answer. I mean, I was pleased that there was an increased understanding, even an increased discussion, and some green shoots. But the COVID pandemic was my final year. The Children's Commissioner is a 6-year post, a fixed term,
Tricky for you.
and the
Yeah.
COVID came along in the last year. And to me, that was the biggest test our country ever had in terms of how it protects, how it views children, how the
Mm.
system of support for children
Mm.
is working and set up. And in my view, for the most vulnerable children, it failed. Um,
Did you manage to give when you give evidence to the COVID inquiry, did you manage to get your point across, do you think, successfully?
Oh yeah, I think Baroness Hallett was very clear that actually, in my view, children were not only overlooked, often were ignored during that period, and some
Mm.
of it is down to the fact that our machinery of government just doesn't have that emphasis on children, or that clear commitment of priority to children that some other countries do. So if it comes down to the will of those in power to decide whether they want to prioritize children or not, well, actually, in my view, they weren't prioritized. And the reason behind the vulnerability work, and the like, really drew from the fact that, when I come into post, lots of people said to me, I talked to different policy teams, different departments, and they'd all say, well, our minister's very concerned about the vulnerable. And I'd say, like who? And everyone would describe that vulnerability through the lens of that department. So health would talk about, potential people who are patients. In education, it'd be pupils. In the Ministry of Justice, it would be people, young people in custody. It was all a segment or a symptom of what was going wrong, rather than children in the round, and rather than, a commitment to children, in their own right. So we were being ambitious and thinking big about this, but it was always going to be more than a 3 or 4 year project. It was always going to be a project that took at least 10 years, which in part drove us to the point where we not only set up the Commission on Young Lives, because that was, for me, the group of children, teens, who were most at risk and furthest away from a policy solution. There was a policy void, in my view, in government. But then on to the Centre for Young Lives and the work we're now doing.
Okay. Can I just ask you quickly then, two things. Firstly, do you see evidence that your successor, Rachel, is actually kind of managing to develop things further as well now? And have you got some optimism there? But you also didn't actually say what are some of the things, or at least one of the things that you feel unfortunate about, that it was a regret, if you like, that didn't manage to happen.
Well, I think that 6 years when you set out feels like a very long time.
Yeah.
It quickly goes past. And with the last year taken with the pandemic, you don't get, you're never going to be able to do what you want, everything you want. So, I'm really proud. Work on mental health, work on social media, work on kids who fall through the gap in education. What do I regret? Well, I regret we didn't have more time to embed the vulnerability work.
Yeah.
I regret that we couldn't get through the kind of support for early intervention that we might have wanted. But look, you haven't got, you haven't got the power to do that in that role. You're
No,
reliant
I do understand that.
on those, you're reliant on the politicians of the day.
Yeah. Do you feel that the Children's Commissioner's Office now has got a higher profile? Well, as much thanks to yourself as anything else. I mean, you've managed to actually push the profile forward.
Yeah, we worked hard on that because we knew that, some of this was convincing the public that children not only needed to be a priority, which of course everyone would say in terms of in terms of their own kind of context, but actually as a nation, actually a lot of people assume that children have a much higher priority with decision makers than they had. So, very much part of that was talking to parents, talking to children, but, really taking the general public with you. And I think over that time, there was a sea change in attitude towards the kind of support that children should get, especially around some of the things that I've mentioned. But
well, look, let me interrupt you a second, just to say, because I want to get to the Centre for Young Lives and then on also to talk about your book. So let's try a segue then about, have you managed to take forward into your work with the Centre for Young Lives much of the drive that you actually started, if you like, when you were commissioner?
Well, the work that we've been doing as a commission on Young Lives and now the Centre for Young Lives is a
Mm.
direct continuation of the focus on vulnerability that
Yeah.
I've had over, well, throughout my work, to be honest, but certainly from the Children's Commissioner time, more visibly so. There's a group of us that have founded the Centre for Young Lives who work together and have worked together for a number of years. In part during the time as Children's Commissioner as well. And when we set up the Commission on Young Lives, looking at vulnerable teenagers, especially those at risk of violence and harm, that for me was really a gap in policy within government. There just wasn't the kind of infrastructure there that would look at these children, nor was there the policy teams there looking at solutions or being able to put these through as a priority. So we also knew, everyone sees the headlines, how many young people are at risk of harm and danger, and the headlines speak for themselves. We spent a year talking to those who know how to make a difference, and communities and young people and their families, and put forward a platform that we think is ambitious. At the heart of that was a series of hubs for young people who it's almost a sure start for teens. And I'm delighted that that was one of the commitments that the Prime Minister backed, put it in his manifesto, and is now being prepared for delivery. And in the book, I talk about some of those conversations with those young people.
Well, let's just clarify what the book is first, all right? Because I think people will
So
want
the book narrates and tells a story, sets out the policy context, and the solutions as we saw them and as I saw them around young people who were not getting the chance in life that they should. So Young Lives, Big Ambitions.
That's right. That's the
title
title.
tells-
And it says on it, transforming life chances for vulnerable children and teens. So, I mean,
That's
it's
right.
pretty clear what it actually is setting out to do. And I must say that the actual the critiques from all sorts of different people that are actually there at front, very impressive. And actually, the idea that although you actually are pretty worried at the moment about the, if you like, the attention and the resources, and if you like, even the understanding of what children need at the moment,
Yeah.
but on the other hand, you do feel that how many of children's lives have been wasted, but you talk about how you can turn it around. You talk about hope. You haven't just identified the problem as far as I can understand it.
Yeah.
And people seem to
Well,
really appreciate that.
Well, I hope so. I mean, this is a book which was tough to write. I know it's tough going to read. But ultimately, it's about what not only we should do about this, but what we can do about this. I mean, we look at some of the serious case reviews that shows, phrase we're always very familiar with, of opportunities missed, of young people who, through a series of kind of stages, become marginalized, fall through the gaps in school, start to be targeted by adults who want to exploit them, sometimes fall into crime and the criminal justice system, sometimes ending with tragedy. And talk to parents about, not only what that meant, but what could have made the difference. Talk to young people about what could have made the difference. And it seemed to me that we have a system at the moment that far too often kind of leans away from those young people. Terms, you hear terms like, they're too old to help, they're too complicated, you can't help some children, especially when they get a bit older. And I just wasn't ready to accept that, because not only could you see where it was going well, and where there were brilliant small scale community organizations transforming lives, but also you knew from those conversations what would have made the difference.
There's such a lot to combat, isn't there, though? On the other, I mean, there's, apart from county lines, knife crime, violence, poverty, There's
Yeah.
also the issues now that we have to consider of slavery or human trafficking and just
Of course.
exploitation on the internet generally as well. I mean, the whole
Well,
thing.
there's a lot of, there's a lot of things that young people have to contend with. But at the heart of this, if you have protective factors around you, if you have relationships in your family that you can count on and that are there for you, if you have relationships with teachers, if you have relationships with youth workers, if you have
Mhm.
places to go where you can get support and be with friends, if your school is responsive to you when you say you're having a tough time or that you're concerned about your well-being, or you're struggling, risk of exclusion, if you
Yeah.
get a school that leans into you and can offer that support, then so many times children can overcome those and continue successfully. And what we looked at in the commission, and what I look in the book, is at every part of that system, what would that mean? Well, it would mean that, schools would be inclusive. They'd recognize that some kids needed extra help. They would have those relationship with support services in place to be able to wrap around them. I know more difficult because austerity has meant that there's less and less of a resource there, but nonetheless, with a will and commitment from the school, so many kids, you could see, I've visited them, could actually achieve great things, be able to have mental health support that came to the kids. So many said that I'm not going to want to go to clinics. I'm not going to go and be referred to a doctor, but actually it would be great if there was someone I could go and talk to. So prioritizing, again, bending the system towards young people, working with families to prevent children getting into crisis and getting into care. But if they do have to go into care, making sure that it's responsive to them, their needs as teenagers. All of those things combined where, the young person can get the benefit of that support.
Well, let me ask you something, if I might, just
Yeah.
so before we leave that particular part of things. I remember when we were talking before, just chatting, if you like, about this program. You talked of the thousands of teenagers who are on unregulated accommodation,
Mm.
and you mentioned also the McAllister Review of Children's Social Care. So
Yeah, absolutely.
I thought you might want to sort of amplify that a little bit.
Yeah, well, while I was
Mm.
writing the book, the Josh McAllister's review was being undertaken, and I was looking particularly at how teenagers fare in the care system. And of course, there's been a huge growth of teens going into care, but the care system hasn't been able to keep pace or be able to provide the support often that teenagers need. But that makes them doubly vulnerable, of course. They're far away from home often. Um, they've lost their network of friends. Sometimes there's real issues around contextual safeguarding in the first place that meant they've been there. But very, very often they were placed in what then was referred to as unregulated accommodation. Young people told me how they were moved very often. They were put into places that were unsafe. And they were put into places where those that wished to exploit you knew exactly where you were. So as part
Okay.
of the
Okay.
McAllister Review, I was feeding in from the commission and from the conversations around this book, around what some of the solutions could be. Try and work with families. Let's put protective arms around families and support for families, so teens didn't have to go into care. Identify young people earlier.
Yeah.
Take more of priority around kinship care, and
Can I just
reset
take you
that
away from
care
can I
system.
just take you away from, sorry, interrupt, but from the family for a second, because before we lose that point, would you say that you managed to find a lot of evidence to do with what some people say in significant numbers of feral children?
Well, I think the young people that I spoke to, and
Mm.
I'm not quite sure what what you define as feral children as
Oh,
such.
well, who are living on the streets or living under bridges or
Well,
living in the
certainly, of course,
countryside.
there are some kids that are homeless, but
Hmm.
often they're homeless because, again, they've dropped through a system. So a lot of those kids in unregulated accommodation, I was absolutely clear
Right.
that that was
Hmm.
letting kids down and was actually putting them into very often a position of greater
Hmm.
threat.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
some of those young people would run, they would go missing from that accommodation. So the number of times they were moved, the fact that they would so often go missing, just expanded and accelerated the risks that they were living with in their lives. And I wanted and was very supportive of the McAllister Review recommendations around that move to family support, that move to family group conferences, that move to kinship care, but also very specifically, while you have teenagers coming into care and in care, you needed a system that not only had the resources to be able to support them, but the confidence and the skills within that. So, for instance, with foster carers, well, one thing that I was really very taken by was the notion that we could be looking to recruit youth workers as foster carers, for instance. If young people are able to build a
Hmm.
positive relationship with those who have those, that's their skill set, then that surely must speak to us as a positive way
Yeah.
forward. But
Yeah.
it's there to be done, and I would still say that we need to get on and get that
Okay.
delivered.
Well, look, we've got about 5 or 10 minutes left. So, I mean, there's something I do want to ask you if I may, and then we'll make sure we actually sort of big up the book again because I think it's very well worth reading. So I want people to listen. Um, did you talk much and have you built up a big network, partly when you were commissioner and obviously now, with European peers, opposite numbers?
Hmm.
And I mean, my view has always been having no problem in lightheartedly, but stealing from the neighbors. I mean,
Hmm.
in terms of taking projects that are working in other countries and actually somehow or other fitting them into our culture. Did that happen as much as you'd like? Or
Yeah, it does. And it's probably a network that is, underused slightly, if you like. There's a
yeah,
European network of children's commissioners. Most countries across Europe will have a children's commissioner. And there's an office and there's some continuity throughout the office and the like. And you'd meet once a year, and there was huge amounts you could gather and glean from that. I went on a number of visits to other countries with children's commissioners to look at what they did when they were further ahead. Went to Sweden and Norway and looked very much at what they did around that kind of pre-secure um, uh, uh, aspect, if you like, or stage in support for young people. So they don't need to be in secure accommodation, but actually they may if they don't get the support they need. And also when they come out of secure accommodation, we went to see those in both those countries. I went to Iceland to look at how they deal with child sexual abuse and the Barnahuses. Very taken by that, and came back and recommended that. But I think that what does strike you when you go to somewhere in Scandinavia or the like is where it doesn't take long in a conversation for someone, a very senior person in government, to tell them that children are very important in this country. We take our commitment to children very serious, to how we define ourselves as a nation. And what was very clear to me is we haven't got there in this country yet. And actually, that was very noticeable during the pandemic. We couldn't fall back on that commitment during the pandemic, so they got lost. So ultimately, in this book, it's how we build a country which is the best place for children to grow up and which does put children as a high priority and centre stage.
Okay.
Both in terms of the machinery and government decisions are made, but also locally in the terms of decisions around our lives and the way we treat and respect young people. Because, if we don't help them to flourish, we don't have a future ourselves.
Well, I wrote something down when we were chatting before, so just trying to remember things. And I can't remember if it was a verbatim quote from you or if it was just my kind of interpretation of what you said. But clearly fitting into what you've just talked about the government, etc. I've got down here, we need more ambition in the corridors of power.
Mm.
Now, I imagine you'd agree with that, whether you said it verbatim or not. But if I put it down as what I thought you said.
Yeah, I mean, we need ambition for our country.
Yeah.
Having ambition for our country means having ambition for our children. They're 20% of our population. They're going to be 100% of the future. And short-termism can often dissuade against from that ambition. Can't be done. We don't have enough money. It's going to be difficult. It's not how that workforce works. All of those things. We need to be ambitious for our children. They need us to be so. It's our responsibility. And I think, we do have a new government, of course, over recent weeks. And we are seeing the difference that some of that political will and ambition can bring with some of the things we've heard about ambition in terms of education for all children, in terms of the willingness to tackle knife crime and also young futures and prevent some of that. Now, of course, that needs seeing through. Of course, it won't happen of its own accord and it will take money. But the difference it can make if you do have a government that has that ambition and wants to make that change, not least as well about child poverty, and great to see the Child Poverty Task Force up and running. But it needs to follow through. It needs to be something that isn't actually about party politics. It's about
politics has always been like that, hasn't it? You really have to wait to see if whoever promised something.
Yeah, but it can't be something which can be dismantled overnight. It needs to become part of how we define ourselves as a nation. And that, I think, is a challenge now in this period where we have political will to make many of these changes. Of course, to make those changes, but to embed it with deep roots in our society, in the way we make decisions and across government.
Okay. Well, look, let's finish up by reminding people about your book. And let me just start, if I might, that part of it. There's so many different people in here who've actually given glowing references for your book. But there's one who's from a journalist I've just noticed that I really rate highly, Kathy Newman from Channel 4 News, who said, Britain's young people have no more powerful advocate than Anne Longfield. Young Lives, Big Ambitions is a powerful wake-up call for political leaders and a devastating critique of inaction to date. Well, I think that sort of sums it up, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So it's called Young Lives, Big Ambitions. Now, all the details of this I'm going to put on the front page of the podcast, the text part, for people listening, and any links that you've got, Anne, you me or your office or whatever, and we'll put them on, or either about how to get in touch with you or how to get the book, obviously, and maybe even what events are coming up that you've got a particular.
Yeah, fantastic.
So we'll put all of that as a package on the front. So just maybe for the last sort of 30 seconds, minute, whatever, people listening really could well become inspired by what you're saying. How would you advise people if they're thinking about going into sort of services for young people, working with young people, supporting young people, whether it's voluntary or statutory or whatever? Encourage, I suspect you would, people to go into that line of work.
Absolutely. We need our most brilliant people to be working with and for children and young people, and of course so many are, I think the rewards are not only, of course, rewards in those relationships and that progress and support with those young people themselves, if you're working face to face, but the rewards really are about changing a system and seeing the impact it can have on young people's lives. We haven't prioritized children. There's been a devastating consequence of that. And we've seen a huge increase in young people at risk over the last decade, but it doesn't have to be like that. And being part of that change and part of building that system of support that can really be that springboard of success for young people, especially the most disadvantaged around the country, it's a fantastic opportunity. It's there, I think, to be part of over coming years.
Okay. Well, thanks very much again, Anne, for being on the
Thank you.
program and sharing with us the well, not just the book, but actually what actually has caused the book and in your history as well. And I wish you very well. I wish the Centre for Young Lives very well as indeed as well. And make sure that I'll make sure people have got the links to get a hold of them. So thank you very much again for being a guest.
Pleasure. Thank you so much.